Great, let's get started. Welcome everyone to the Salt Lake City Planning Commission meeting of September 30th, 2020. This is mainly a work session, but we do have a couple of items before we get to the work session. Have the approval of the minutes from the August 26th, 2020 meeting. Anyone have any comments on the minutes, or is someone willing to make a motion to approve them?
Madam Chairman, I will move that we approve those minutes.
Okay, we've got a motion by Brenda.
I'll second.
Second by Sarah. And then we'll do the roll call. Matt?
Yes.
Very enthusiastic yes at that. John?
Yes. That was me, not John. Still yes.
Abstain.
Brenda?
Yes?
Amy?
Yes.
Sarah?
Yes.
Maureen?
Yes.
And I think I have to vote for, since John abstained, so I will vote yes. Okay, motion passes. Then we have the report of the chair and the vice chair. I have nothing to report except that I'm in my office today, so enjoy the view. Brenda?
And I have nothing to report either.
Okay. We'll then go to the report of the director. Nick, have anything you want to cover right now?
I do not. I just want to say thank you for everybody for making the time to be able to work this briefing and work session in.
No, thanks to the applicants for being flexible with us and suffering through with us the other evening. We apologize about that, but we appreciate your flexibility. Okay, let's go ahead to the work sessions. The first one is 800 South and State Street design review at approximately 754 South State Street, which is case number PLN-PCM 2020-00439. And is Nanette doing the staff presentation?
I am.
Great.
Nick, could you allow me to share my screen? Okay. I'm just sharing my screen. So Salt Lake City received a request for a design review for modifications to design standards to develop the property located at approximately 745 South State Street. The project is a proposed 11-story mixed-use development with 360 residential units, with common areas on the upper floors and commercial and retail uses on the ground and second floor. The project site is located in the downtown support district and is within the downtown master plan. Presently, the project site is occupied by a vacant, what used to be the Sears building and surrounding parking lot. The Sears building was vacated in 2018 and has remained vacant since. Planning staff is requesting the Planning Commission review the proposed design standard modifications as a work session to provide the applicant and staff feedback before the design review returns to the Planning Commission for a public hearing and a final decision. This work session is also a good opportunity to discuss the changes Kimball Investments and Colmena Group are proposing on the larger Sears block. And I'll just go through a brief review of the project to give you additional time with the applicant to discuss for the work session. Presently, the project is meeting or exceeding the majority of the design standards required in the D2 district. This includes ground floor use other than parking on at least 80% of the street facing the street building facade. Durable building materials which cover at least 80% on the ground floor and 50% on the upper floors. Glazing covering at least 40% on the ground floor and 25% on the upper floors. And the blank wall maximum length of 15 feet. The design standards requested by the applicant to be modified through the design review process include the maximum length of a street-facing building facade of 200 feet. The applicant is requesting 373 feet for the building length. Additional additional building height exceeding 65 feet up to a maximum of 120 feet. The applicant is requesting 123 feet with a 5-foot parapet wall, which is allowed to exceed into the maximum building height. And the final request is for operable building entrances at least every 50 feet on street-facing building facades. The proposal includes a range from 35 feet to 90-foot separation. Representatives with Colmena Group and Kimball Investment have worked with planning staff and have been very responsive to planning comments to change the building design to better interact with important city corridors. Staff is recommending Planning Commission to consider 3 questions in their discussion with the applicants to provide feedback on the requested additional building height and facade length of the proposed project. The first question is, are the setbacks, material changes, and glazing sufficient to warrant an approximately 85% increase in the street facade length while still maintaining a rhythm and repetition experience of the pedestrian? The second, while the downtown master plan identifies South State as a mid-rise corridor, does the architecture justify the visual impact of the requested additional height by providing a well-designed building with a distinct top, middle, and bottom interest in the structure? And when determining whether the subject property relates to the height and scale of adjacent and nearby properties, should the redevelopment potential of adjacent properties be considered? And that concludes my presentation.
Great. Thanks, Nanette. Anyone have questions for Nanette at this point? No? Okay. We'll move to the applicant.
Ryan and Abir, who do you want to make your presentation?
I believe Matt Post is online, and he was going to run that, right, Abir?
Yeah, Matt will run the presentation. He can share his screen, and I just want to confirm that our architect, Eduardo Yanez, was able to join. I know he was having trouble connecting. Nick, are you able to see Eduardo and Matt Post?
It looks like they're both here.
Okay, great.
Yes.
And Matt, you now have the controls to share your screen.
Excellent. Are you able to see the rendering?
Yeah.
Excellent.
All right. Well, hey, first I'd like to thank Nan and her team, all of staff for the time they've spent. All been really generous with your time and made some very insightful comments. Commissioners, thank you for your time and working with us this afternoon to discuss our master plan, now of the Sears block, now called Copper Yards, and specifically our first phase, the jetty, which is this building you see. My name is Ryan Kimball with Kimball Investment Company. Also online is my partner, Abir Malik, with Colmena Group, along with the project's architects, Eduardo Yanez and Matt Post with Oz Architecture out of Denver. Let's see, Matt, next slide. This is the block today. We are fortunate to have great neighbors. Center block along 700 South is the recently raised Deseret Mortuary, now owned by the LDS Church. SAPA Investment Group, along with Retrospect Water and Light, are just to the east, and we value each of them and very much see both as a benefit and amenity to our future residents and tenants. Looking back at the beginning, or the plat of Zion, you can see that Salt Lake's large blocks had an emphasis on building along the perimeters. It's kind of hard to see in that first slide, but that's what the dots are. With community agriculture situated within the center, we were inspired by the concept of central green amenities within these large blocks. However, live, work, and commute have very drastically changed and present challenges to modern urban development. The opportunity to deconstruct nearly an entire super block is really exciting. Our focus to create a strong yet welcoming edge with defined and accessible passageways into the center park, reminiscent of the interior community agriculture espoused by the Plat of Zion, The 660-foot-long super block was broken into 9 quadrants, each approximately 200 feet by 200 feet, separated by streets. We further refined the quadrants by connecting the ones along the edge to optimize the number of vehicular penetrations to the core. The strategy optimized the circulation of the vehicles within the site, as well as allowing pedestrian connectivity through to the park. We have actively worked with the mayor's office, city council, RDA, and staff, and have noted the common sound bites from each, which include Salt Lake's master plan shows downtown extending south to 900 South. Density was encouraged. Incorporate the city's Life on State plan, which specifically mentions living and retail opportunities with a focus on healthy and sustainable design, and proximity to transit. We have worked with the city and others to successfully add a new track station at 650 South Main, which is the southernmost Main Street station and critical to connect Copper Yards to historic downtown. The jetty, along with the park, is the first phase of several and will begin to bookend the southern border of downtown, as well as kick off the State Street redevelopment area. It is important to note that the jetty is the only phase that faces a state road. As part of the master plan, we have met with UDOT to determine where our State Street access will be allowed. UDOT mandated the distance away from the 800 South intersection, which happened to also be the approximate location of the future mid-block crossing. Feature that will eventually yards to Food Alley, along with the other businesses on the east side of State Street. Now I'd like to turn the remainder of the time over to Eduardo to speak specifically on the unique design elements of the jetty. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioners, my name is Eduardo Llanes. I hope you can hear me well. Somebody.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Thanks. We are delighted to be here. This project has brought a lot of the urban fabric discussions to understanding how planning and architecture, most importantly, the human experience relates to redevelopment within the core of a downtown site. As such, and you have seen, is we have prepared a very diligent booklet of the design process to identify and illustrate to you how we have looked at the big, what we call the super block, and understanding as we evaluate this process, as Ryan has shown to you, how we deal with a 10-acre site, the super block, if you will, and how we evaluate the improvements that we could create to move from a automobile-centric experience to more of a pedestrian feel on a site that is so close to your downtown, and probably as things evolve over time is going to become part of the core of downtown as well. So a lot of developments around us that have impact also on the urban fabric that's changing on your city. If you could give me the next slide, Matt, please. I'm going to now focus on understanding how we are utilizing the land within the property lines allocated for this first project, being the jetty. On the top left, what you're seeing is the block with the new streets identifying in black this site, and more importantly, the importance of the streets that we are creating, internal streets that allow us the visibility from the main streets around the perimeter. Always focus with the fact that out of the 10 acres, all of the sites become more or less about 2 acres. There's about an acre of land dedicated to roads, but we also end up with a park in the middle that is about 1 acre. I want to walk you through these use diagrams, as I said, in red on the top, how we touch the connection between the ground floor and the building, and then on the bottom in yellow, how the building, the residential tower, sits on top. I think it's important for me to illustrate this because it is a big project, but as you break it in parts, you'll all figure out or understand a bit better the design strategies that we crafted with the city, with your city staff, to make sure that we develop a building that is true to the city, to the core of the city. And it has all of the things that we have not seen but your staff and hopefully you can educate us in terms of how we improve all the pieces of this project. The first thing we did is looked at a building that on the ground level, and that's this drawing number 1 there, on the ground level is a commercial base. So the experience between street, sidewalk, and building brings the building to the property line and defines that experience that connects really the sidewalk with the building. It's very porous, it's very transparent, and it's very inviting. When you see the next slide, the vehicular circulation then is limited, so it accesses from only one street around the perimeter of the superblock into the park, but it also allows the other street that's not there to serve as an exit connection for service vehicles for the most part. So then what happens on is the drawing number 3, the pedestrian circulation becomes key of how we identify the corners within the block, and then at the alleyway in the middle where the service or the access to the parking garage is located in such a way that the building has these milestones of arrival that allow that connectivity between the visitor and the interior of the building. The last diagram, it illustrates that indeed on the north side of the property, we have a large retail component, and then around the parking garage with depths of about 25 feet, we also wrap that with retail components, so commercial spaces that hide the access, the pedestrian or the vehicular access to the building, the parking, as well as all the service components of the building. Now, when you look at the upper levels that sit on top of all of this, and I'll describe that plinth, that base a little farther with the elevations of the building, but what you see on the first one is that we maximize that plinth. We started looking at how we put a donut building on top of all of that, and then realized very quickly the importance of articulating that mass in such a way that we take advantage of views, sun access, as well as the connection to the new park that we are building on the west side of this parcel. So we started playing with the building in terms of allowing those spaces not only on the ground level, but also on the upper level that break the mass and allows us to have a different configuration as you walk around the building, okay? On the book that we provided to you, that you have in your package, and it's fine that you pass the slide, Matt, you have a lot of other diagrams that illustrate how the mass is being carved to articulate all of these design parameters that allow us to define the look of the building. In terms of creating a base, as you can see here, where we are very concerned about how the building interacts with the pedestrian experience of the sidewalks around the building. Not only thinking about the vehicles, but more importantly, thinking about what happens when you are experiencing that sidewalk, mostly along State Street, realizing the importance of the corners as well as the porosity to the park beyond. What you see here is that we modified the drawing so it fits on the page. Now north, meaning downtown, is to the left, and the south corner is to the right of the page. On the north, as you can see, we have a lot of retail, and we moved it back in such a way that the new street that we are connecting to the park from State Street is located in a way that allows the building to open up a better glance of what happens within the property, the larger property, the park in board. And also it has a colonnade to define the large retail space that is anchoring that corner and giving a lot of visibility to this building as you're coming from downtown going south. You see also that on the south, east, and west, on the right side of the page, the commercial space is different. It's 25 feet in depth. but it does hide all of the garage and service areas of the facility in such a way that the building does not have a back door, if you will. It's always fronting and it's always encouraging that experience between sidewalk and storefront. The parking entry is located at the bottom, as you saw in the diagrams. It allows service vehicles to go through and be in an enclosed yard, providing the service to the retail, the trash pickup, the moving traffic that may come with people are moving to the residences above and so forth. Now, when we evaluated what we can do regarding the services, we wanted to make sure that all of the transformers especially were hidden, but we're having some issues with the city, or not the city, Rocky Mountain Power, in terms of how we locate them and how big they need to be, such a way that we move them to be on an interior street facing the facade of a future building to the west. The ground level in this regard is allowing a lot of porosity by we're locating doors where potential tenants may come today, but also realize very quickly that the tenants may change over time, therefore the location of doors may change accordingly. Now there are some constraints that we need to make sure that get resolved that have to do with the topography of the site and how from the north to the south there's a drop that we need to take into account as we create these commercial spaces. However, we know that the facade itself needs to be pretty much like a mall, porous enough and create a bulkhead so that those doors could occur in many different places. Reality is that for us, as we're looking at the project today, we are locating them in accordance to what the code requires and making sure that we are providing enough glazing to the storefront such that the facade is very porous and transparent. Next slide, please. We looked, of course, there's 3 points that we need to address. One is the height, the other one is the location of entries, and the other one has to do with the length of the facade. And let me start with that. As we're trying to understand the code and we need to make sure that we comply with it, yes, indeed, the building as a whole is going to have a deep hole as we have a parking garage below it. But the moment we come up to the ground level and we have the user experience, the key for us was to make sure that the mass is broken into different pieces. The first exercise was to break it from the bottom, which you see that salmon color with the blue on top, that we are noting it as the plinth of the building that relates to the size of the buildings, existing buildings, beside us and across the street and up and down State Street. We are allowing that to be only 3 levels, but as you can see in length, we break the facade so it feels like a series of different buildings that have occurred over time, even though this is developed all at once. And you're going to see that better on the elevations. Now, on top of that plinth of 3 levels, we have the residential component that does something very similar. It breaks the mass as the building recesses back about, 80 to 100 feet, such that the building presence on the street, on the pedestrian experience, is broken into shorter masses. As you can see here, we define it as building A and building B. We're also playing with materiality in such a way that the building, building A, the upper part in yellow, is different than building B, the upper part in yellow as well. And they all sit on a plinth, this 3-story base, that changes from back. In the middle of the building, we have that service alley that's becoming almost a divider, if you will, that creates this mass, and that's going to be the vertical circulation below the building, that is as important to us as it allows us to illustrate how the building is grounded to the site. you will see as well that it becomes iconic in the sense that it allows you to reference where the main entries to the apartment lobbies are located. You also see that on the fourth level of the building, we do have a component that is an amenity to be used by, and this is a debate that our client's been having of how we introduce, let's say if there's a grocer on this site, on the big north part of the property, that maybe they could utilize that space as well. The question is how we provide a community of 300 or so, 350 apartments, a lot of people living here, with the opportunities to experience not only the city fabric with the park behind us, but also there are some spaces that are created above the ground right away, if you will. The height of the building on the right side of this page, which happens to be the north wing, is pushing the 11 stories, and therefore it gets right below, actually the roof height is right below the allowed height at 120, which counts for a parapet, and we are leaving ourselves enough room such that we know that we're going to be able to drain that roof accordingly. The NAN was very careful about telling you that the building has a roof height of 117 feet plus a 5-foot overhang, the overhang being that eave on top of that roof line. There are going to be a couple of components, elevator overruns and so forth, that are a little bit higher than that, and roof screens that hide all the mechanical equipment on top. But this, as difficult to read as it is, it kind of gives you an idea of how we have played the mass to break it into different components. You give me the next slide, please. So when you look at how the building feels as you come down on State Street, this corner to what we're calling Future Street A, defines that big plinth that is 3 stories in height with on this corner, hopefully a market that is 2 stories in volume. You know, we're going to allow the market enough space that if they wanted to have a mezzanine that, let's say, projects through with a dining space that hovers over State Street, that would be great. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but the idea is that that base is recessed back, so it's very inviting to people to come in. And it also, as you can see on the far right of the page at the bottom, that the park hoping has an iconic element that is drawing you to this great amenity that we have for the city. The pedestrian experience then is rational to the human scale, as is defining the idea that you could, and is directing you, connect to different parts of the building accordingly. This third floor that you see there is a parking garage. It's a full floor of parking that is hidden behind a screen that defines that base for the building as a whole. We see that, I mean, we're looking at different materials for that. It's going to be a metal that is hiding the vehicles, but it also wants to have some type of a presence in terms of changing facade, either be with metal panels that are with bandings or the perforated metal materials. The colonnade that you see defines the superstructure to support the upper part of the building, but it also relates to creating an urban experience that is deep in nature and allows, as I said, that porosity to the retail space on the bottom. Give me the other corner, please. You're looking at the building now from the south side as we're approaching downtown from the south on State Street, and what you're seeing is that the building has a different look altogether. You saw that we, in the upper part of the building, we have that orange color that is a brick material, and the dark, almost black, we're thinking is a metal material, that it gives us a sense of an industrial roots of this part of town, with materials that are rich and durable on the upper part. And on the bottom, you see how the facade now has changed dramatically. The plinth remains, and the retail base is very similar, and yet is now reflecting the nature of potentially a very different retailer. Abir and Ryan call it the idea of bringing the maker's block by allowing little spaces for boutiques or shops that relate to the demographics that can't afford the big space that a national chain may have on the north side.
Hey, Eduardo, I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm being told by planning that we've gone over our allotted time for the intro. I don't know if you want to take like another 30 seconds to wrap up, and then the planning commission can start their questions.
Eduardo, I just wanted to make sure Planning Commission has enough time for their discussion, because I think it would be really helpful for a discussion to occur.
So, Madam Chair, can I take a little bit longer then?
Yeah, a few more minutes to wrap up, and I'm sure we'll have questions that will trigger some responses from you, maybe in parts of the presentation that we didn't get to cover.
Well, the importance of the building having its own unique personality that is different depending of the approach from which side you're looking at the building was a very important element in our discussion within ourselves and also with staff. And the idea that Life on State wants to improve the pedestrian activation of the ground levels. So as I was saying, the activation of this southern part of the block along State Street is addressing a different type of tenant, and yet the corner itself has a very friendly encounter with the passerby via vehicles and or pedestrian. What we really are pushing for here is the introduction of a lot of glass and a lot of, I'm going to repeat myself, transparency and porosity to the experience that happens between sidewalk and building wall. And yet you see that the spaces are going to be 2 stories in volume as well, and that the facade in this instance now continues up, hiding still the parking structure on the 3rd floor and being different than the facade on the north end of the block, such that the pedestrian experience is always encouraged by a different character of a building facade. Okay. Next slide, please. And here's where, of course, we start to capture the quality, the textile quality almost of the passerby that might want to see in, look up, and also maybe even touch the building because it has a presence that is totally hiding the automobile behind us, even though the boulevards are allowing a lot of traffic still. The right-of-ways here are about 130 feet or so. But the building itself at this level is illustrating the fact that we are utilizing very rich, very durable, very urban materials in the facade. If you look at the building on top, however, the building is setting back a bit in such a way that these 3 levels relate to the water line that the city has with existing buildings that are 1, 2, and 3 stories in height. Now we have a series of other views that are not as good as this one in terms of the articulation of the rendering, but it's allowing you to understand the corner as we're going to walk you around. This is the middle of the building, the service yard, and the entry to the residential tower, and then retail on both sides. As you're going down State Street, what can we do with the sidewalk? It's not that deep. As I said, Life on State is trying to widen the sidewalk such that the pedestrian experience is enhanced. And yet we are still thinking that with the ability of introducing a lot of glass here, we are creating a little more depth to that feel of pedestrian activity. Now we are looking at the building from the southwest. You see that this is kind of our back of house at the ground level at least, but we have to put this very large panels that we are thinking we're going to treat as art walls, and those are the rolling doors for the transformer enclosures. Our hope here is that with branding, we can create a story that is not only about the building, but about the neighborhood in terms of allowing the ability to introduce art to the facade.
So Eduardo, I'm going to interrupt you right now for just a minute. I want to check in with the commissioners to see anyone has questions or comments thus far, because we do have only about 25 more minutes.
There's a view from the park, looking at the front door and another colonnade, the pool above.
Got it.
But it might be, Matt, why don't you just go through the last images that we have rapidly, and then we should just pass it to you, Madam Chair.
I have some questions when you're ready.
We're ready.
Go ahead, Brenda.
So let's go back to the slides that show the master plan for the block, which I believe are like really in the beginning, right here. So I see in your, you do also have well, let me ask you, what is the status of this master plan in terms of approvals for the subdivisions and the park itself, and having it, is it going to be a dedicated park, a public park, and the status of the streets? I know in your subdivision plan, you have 2 of the streets that appear. The one that is coming off of State Street and the one that's coming off of Main Street, but the others are not in the plan, in the subdivision plan, and neither is the park. So I'm wondering where all of those things are.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Brenda, for bringing that up. So right now, the status of this master plan is, if you're familiar with the block, there's currently a city road that bisects the block coming in off of 7 South, and it dead ends into the existing Sears building. That's
Yes.
Major Street.
I'm familiar with that, yes.
Yep. So we are working on vacating Major Street, and such that we can then move forward with the park and with some of our other roads. Since that hasn't been done yet, we are moving forward with this first phase under parcel line adjustment. And then as we vacate Major Street, we'll be able to move forward with the rest of the interior street grid. And then to answer your question about the park will be available and accessible to the public. However, we want to keep it privately owned, and that's so that, as Eduardo talked about, and Matt and Ryan also mentioned this, we're not only trying to activate the exterior, we're also trying to activate the interior. And part of that is having outdoor dining and restaurants, and the ability to serve alcohol in those restaurants is really important for us for that activation. And that's why we want to keep that park private. For all intents and purposes, the public will not know if it's public or private.
Okay, so the other question is, are these new streets, or especially the one that is directly on the west side of the project, is that going to be built as a part of the project, the north one and the west one?
Those will not be part of this first phase. They're going to be part of our future phases.
So how do we access all of that lovely stuff you have there on the west side, and the retail and so forth?
No, the north side of the street and the west side of the building, that will be part of our phase 1.
Oh, sorry, you're talking about on phase 1. Yeah.
Additionally, the park will have in all of our storm tech chambers, which is underground water detection for all phases. So a lot of that underground infrastructure will go in at that same time. The park cannot perfected in its entirety until the vacation of Major Street. But we really hope to have that timed in a way that all of the speech, I don't know, that's not my mic, but all of that will.
Sorry, if you want to mute me, I don't know if you can mute the presenter. Sorry, it's my kids. Sorry.
So anyways, if that makes sense, so a portion of New Street A and all of New Street B will go in with the jetty, and parcel 4 will be built as well and will open 30 minutes thereafter. And really, about the plat, the plat will be finished ahead of the jetty as well. It's just in an effort to get building, we can do this with a parcel line adjustment and pull that permit. Thanks, Matt.
So are all the buildings in this block going to be the 373 feet long? I mean, is 1 and 2 also, you're going to be here looking for extensions and all that?
And there's at this point in the master plan, we don't know what those uses are. I could tell you high level off the parcel 1 seems to be an office parcel. A lot of these ideas were pre-COVID, frankly. And so in the one thing that for us, the jetty accomplishes is it kickstarts the project. It allows all the initial infrastructure to go in with the park. And lastly, it satisfies the opportunity zone timing investment without the initial pre-leasing that would need to occur for an office development. But UDOT is, again, the primary issue here is the amount of length that UDOT was requiring in queuing between 8 South and where this mid block. They only wanted one access point between here and 7th, and they wanted it to be as close to mid block as possible. Did that answer your question, Matt?
But the size of the parcels is longer than if you were to build, lot line to lot line. The length of that building would also exceed the requirements in this zone, correct? So you would need exceptions for building length for the other development parcels. I think that's the question.
Well, and that's to be determined. At this point in time, we're not asking for that consideration.
We understand, but you're creating a lot that could accommodate a building that would exceed the length of what's permitted.
Correct.
Okay. Any other questions for the applicants? And then we do want to address the questions that staff posed. So if people have comments on the 3 questions from staff.
Can we get question number 1 back up? All I had time to write down was, are setbacks sufficient? And now I can't quite remember the full context of that question.
The questions are in the staff report. I think it's just under the discussion section.
Yeah, and I don't have my staff report with me because I didn't charge the Nook thing, so I couldn't access it today. Put your slide back up that you had in your presentation, Nan, that would be great.
Okay. Nick, can you allow me to share my screen? Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Are you able to see the questions?
Yeah, we see them.
Great.
Thank you. So in terms of the first question, regarding the requested increase in street facade, do others have thoughts to share with staff and with the applicant on this question?
Yeah. So, and I apologize for not remembering to charge that thing, but this is off my normal schedule, this meeting. Can we look at the street level of this development again? Because I don't really feel like we did enough to really get an idea of how we're engaging. Look at that eye level at the street to really kind of ascertain what this might look like at 373 feet long.
Are you looking for the renderings?
Yeah, something to give you an idea of as a pedestrian
Okay.
what we're looking at. I mean, this kind of helps, but it's hard for me to say if I think all of these things, the material changes and the glazing, et cetera, are okay to allow 373 feet, because that's a lot more than what we allow at 200. I don't really feel like I'm getting a good idea of what it looks like from the sidewalk even, to see if it feels so big, if it feels so long.
There were renderings. There were renderings from the developer in their presentation that were at sidewalk level.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to those, but then I feel bad that I'm making you flip back who's presenting.
That's
So
okay.
I was wondering if Nan had something, but I get that.
Don't think I do. I think that applicant have it.
Yeah, I just switched the presentation back to you, Matt. So if you want to bring it back up.
Hey, Amy, while Matt put it up, I was going to mention, if it wasn't clear before, on the Maker's Row, which is what we're trying to call this, which is on the other end of the building, but I'll start here. We reset, okay. This is Maker's Row. And so these storefronts are very close together. And our intention with signage and so forth is to make each storefront unique and really break up that experience. On the north side of the service entrance, Eduardo, I don't think mentioned this, but the building actually steps inward inside that column line to create more of a table experience and also create, again, a new experience at the pedestrian level walking on the sidewalk.
He did mention that. I mean, I think from this view, it does still feel really, really long. It feels really long. And I don't see where visually enough, if you were a pedestrian walking, that you would think, oh, I've got some relief from this building. It feels really big. And I don't know that I'm keen on 373 feet at this point.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Hey, Matt, could you jump to the site plan real quick, the ground floor plan? So, Amy, to talk through a little bit about what's happening from a pedestrian level, I think this is a helpful diagram to look at. On the left is the north, and to the top of the page is State Street. The area of Retail 1 against State Street, as Ryan indicated and Matt mentioned, that's set back. And so that'll have outdoor dining. It'll have a very different feel to it. The service alley, while it's not...
Yeah, can you tell me what's the length from that top right corner from 8 South and State Street to then what you're calling the service alley? What's the length of that?
Sure. Matt, do you know that offhand?
There's another slide where A and B is broken up.
Yeah, I can't remember what that length is. Maybe Matt can find that out. It is 115 feet from the building corner, not including the colonnade, which is open space, to the edge of the service alley.
But that service alley doesn't go all the way through, does it?
It does, yeah. The service alley. If you go back, Matt, to the ground floor, I can walk you all through that a little bit more. The service alley does go all the way through. Cars will pull in from the bottom of the page, and public vehicles will pull into the garage. However, we will have gates there to where all of our service for the building, whether that's inventory for the retail tenants, whether it's trash pickup, utility vehicles, all of that is being done off street. We wanted to maintain that vibrant living edge of the building. So all of the service will take place in this service alley, and then those trucks have a one-way access onto State Street. This was what we were able to convince UDOT to allow. They wouldn't allow it to be a public street because, as Ryan indicated, they have certain queuing requirements at the light at 8th South. So we weren't able to get a public road through here, but we were able to get a service drive
Service
through here.
trucks
That'll
enter
break it up.
in on the west, and they drive all the way through, do their business, then drive out on the east.
That's exactly right. It's one way. And
are there garage doors, or is that area closed off, or is a pedestrian be able to look down and see down that whole alleyway while walking by?
no, it's not intended to be an overhead garage door. They're kind of swing gate doors that'll be access controlled, that will open when a truck pulls up, and they'll be able to get access in, and then those gates will close.
So I'm wondering what that looks like on the east side as a pedestrian, because there was like that very, that concrete wall that seemed to jut out to your property line. What's happening there? Because I feel like in some regards, these almost two buildings can be broken up better. And this is the key point, I think, is right here is the service road.
Yeah.
And how that's looking from a pedestrian point of view so that it doesn't feel disengaging, or it doesn't feel like this place that you're not welcome.
No, for sure. And Matt, before you jump to that next slide, so Amy, if you look right to the right of the service alley, you'll see that white stair tower. That's what's jutting out, and that's kind of what's defining a building entryway, but that's kind of breaking up the ground floor experience. So you'll walk across a grocer on the left, there'll then be this service alley, and then you'll see this white concrete element, and then you'll have what we call a maker's row. It's the small commercial space. It's the hat maker and the ethnic food owner. It's getting them the ability to have an affordable address on State Street. And so,
so Javier, you're saying you're going to have a haberdashery?
I didn't know that was a word, but if that's a hat maker, those are the types of tenants that we're trying to go after, like the makers in our city.
So I really feel like I want to see more how that section right there is treated for the pedestrian in the future when you come back, because I don't think you really have what I'm totally looking for, but I'm really concerned about the feeling of 373 feet, but I do believe if we're treating this point better in terms of the visual aspect of that gate. So it doesn't, when you walk downtown and there's those service alleys that have the big, garage door that has to go open, and it doesn't feel inviting. It doesn't feel like it fits there. So how you treat that, how that stairwell access wall is coming out visually to being treated as a pedestrian, I think I'm going to really want to see more there to come to terms with that 373 feet is okay.
I agree with Amy, and if I can jump in, this picture is a perfect example of this feels almost like a hidden entrance. I want this to be a statement entrance for the space, so that there are all these entrances for the small haberdasheries and such, but then there's also this big statement for the residential. And I'm speaking from experience living in a downtown high-rise. Make that, I want the sign bigger. I want something to say this is a home, and this is a home for many. Do something there to help have interaction with the pedestrians there, and people in and out. So that would be jumping on Amy's comment.
That's great feedback. Thank you, Sarah. And thank you, Amy. I've got those things written down. We'll make sure that we show a little bit better experience of what that gate is like and from a pedestrian standpoint. So thank you.
One thing too, just to emphasize this again, is that we were concerned with the length as well, and UDOT is really what dictated the length of this building. I like the idea, Sarah, of making this more prominent as well. This is actually not our main entrance. The entrance is all Parkside, but nonetheless, I like your comment. Just wanted you to be aware of that.
Yeah, the thing I would like to add is, I think what would be helpful is maybe seeing an elevation or a rendered view like maybe the one on the screen that kind of talks about some design guidelines for the retail space. It's difficult to design a space without having a tenant. So what are we allowed to change when you actually have someone move in? Are they going to change just the sign, or are they going to be able to change the facade in a way that creates a unique experience for that specific store? I think telling us a little bit more of that story and letting us understand how you're going to break up that facade throughout the whole block there would really help. Because right now it's a very repetitive design on that, especially on the ground level, of the same storefront over and over again. And I'd like to kind of maybe have more of an explanation of how you're going to approach that and what is allowed through your own design guidelines for that.
Yeah, I can speak to that. It's you're right. Right now, we don't know. It's speculative space meant to be demised. That being said, from a structural standpoint, Eduardo touched on our bulkheads. We can open those up and make those custom. That being said, I think we can work in illustration and with the renderings that we're showing now, even speculative on how to better do that. It's a cost tenant improvement issue for those smaller makers. So I think it behooves us to try to make it the way that Planning Commission would like to see it. But just know that when the tenants come in, if they have the budget and the credit to allow us to take out those storefronts and further customize them like you're used to seeing larger credit tenants do, that's engineered to be allowed.
Yeah, I think just clarifying that a little bit and just saying how far they're allowed to go, because I think that would help us better understand that, or even taking some liberties with it and designing something so that it does feel more, independent. I think my other comment would be, I appreciate when there's a cohesive design thought throughout a project, but I think on a project this size, I hate seeing like 5 different facade materials, overlapping and changing haphazardly. But I do feel like there's a bit of a monotonous facade happening on some part of this building just because of the sheer size. So it'd be nice to see maybe some way of addressing, you talk about it. The architect mentioned how approaching from different angles, you're going to get a different experience. And I like the way that sounds, but I'm not really seeing it in the design. I feel like, maybe there's a different balcony treatment for the different facades, something that kind of integrates it a little bit more. They feel a little tacked on right now. And I think just finding an overall way to actually create that experience is, if you want it to feel like a different building coming from a different direction, then it should feel a little more different, I feel. And I don't want to dictate how to do that. To me, visually, it feels very repetitive. Even though I love the diagrams, I think that they make sense. I think that the bones of the building are really there. It's just figuring out how to create that experience that you're talking about.
Yeah, thanks, John, for that. Just to clarify, are you referring more to the residential portion of the building, or are you referring to the ground floor?
I am. I'm referring to kind of this rendering in particular, where we were talking about this approach feeling different than the approach coming the other direction. And, yes, there's a little bit more glass, but the balconies on this treatment feel very similar to the other side. Really, the only change that visually, at least in the rendering, it feels is the color of the brick. And I feel like it's fairly repetitive. And if there's just a way to kind of break up the mass a little bit more, again, I don't want it to be crazy, but if we could define some areas that, have that difference that's recognizable as a difference, I think that would really help the building overall.
Okay, that's great. Yeah, we'll look at that and look at making some modifications there for our next submission. So yeah, thank you for that.
May I ask a question? very good comment as it relates to the upper part of the building. How do you feel about the material changes to break the mass of the pedestrian experience on the ground levels?
Say that again, because are we talking about the upper level now or the ground level?
No, your comment referenced both, but the idea that you know we on the upper levels we're using metal and brick, and that's the balconies. Yes, indeed, it's a good comment you made. My question was more now about what do you think about the base of the building, the first 3 levels, in terms of how we are breaking the mass to avoid the idea that this is 370 feet long.
Yeah, I personally, I do feel there's a little bit of repetitiveness there as well, where you have those kind of rectangular portal areas in the middle of the building. I think making that corner a little more iconic and making that feel almost like a piece that draws you in, to me, that would really anchor that corner, because right now I feel like it is kind of mirrored almost around the corner, and when you're trying to orient somebody and explain where you are, like say you're getting picked up, how do you explain and have an iconic space where you can say, hey, I'm right here next to this? I think that would help a little bit break up that ground level as well. And I get that there's some economy to repetitive features and detailing, but I think creating those focal points are really important, especially on a corner like that. I think you're close, but I find maybe even with the screen wall or some way to kind of create more of an anchor at that corner and tie that even back to the upper levels, something with that. It's hard to explain, but I think just creating that cohesiveness, that iconic space that you're talking about, I just think it's close, but it's not quite there yet for me.
Oh, that's good. We've been working closely with Nan and Daniel Echeverria and others on staff to work on these specific things, and I think we can spend some time refining those as well. So that's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'd like to touch on the other 2 questions that Nan posed for us. Whether the architecture justifies the additional height and whether we should consider the redevelopment potential of adjacent properties when evaluating this application. So
I would like to speak to that first, because I think one of the things that hasn't been really hit on too much here is that the first level elevation with the retail, the spaces in that are 2-story height. And this is something we rarely see, and it's really a terrific, I think, addition to this building. There are mezzanines and so forth in part of the larger retail spaces, but having that height really gives a sense of really, I think, anchoring that pedestrian experience. And also, we often get, something that's sort of squashed at that level where it's barely any larger than the height of the floor levels at the residential level. So to the extent that that is enabled by having an extra bit of height on this building, I think it's very, very well worth it. And I think it's actually kind of miraculous that this is occurring here. So I do think that the height issue is less of an issue perhaps than the length of the building issue.
I would echo Brenda on that. I think height always becomes a problem where you have to squash the bottom floor to accommodate the height of the units that pay for the building. So I would agree. I think this is a great, kind of creating a public space that has a little bit more of a robust nature to it, and then having the residential on top. I think this is where the city is headed. I think we're kind of preparing for a massive amount of growth that we're going to go through, and these are the types of projects we're going to see more and more of. So I think that this is really actually kind of the right direction for scale. And then it's just figuring out ways to kind of make it feel more human scale and kind of breaking up the masses as we start to develop these large blocks that we have.
Great. Thank you both.
I mean, this is the height is not a, this is not an, I mean, this is allowed through the design review process, correct? There's nothing special being added, like this is allowed by right. And so presumably other buildings in this area are gonna come through here with a design review process as well. That'll be similar height, right, to the, essentially further to the north as it comes to town. Is that correct with staff?
Yeah, that's,
Go ahead.
yeah, that's basically correct. One thing that not related to this project, but we will be considering changes to the downtown building heights coming up in the next 12 months. So just to put that out there, they're probably going to be increased. So.
And then thoughts on consideration of the redevelopment potential of adjacent properties.
So, yeah, and that one, I think that's actually really important when we're looking at this size of a development and redeveloping almost the entire block. So I think that's super important and is one of the reasons why I think these are really good for the working sessions. One thing I would just throw out to you guys, Kimball and Corinna, is that when you do these other buildings, because you're going to be dictating the majority of this block, is make them look different. Make your buildings look really different. So they're not all just the same stuff over and over. That's something that I'll definitely pay attention to when you come back for the other stuff. But like height doesn't bother me. I think this is a good place for it. It's a really good place for it. But yeah, to staff, you should absolutely be looking at the potential and how they want to make these connections and piece this block back together, because that gives us a better picture of what we should be focusing on now is those mid-block connections and how we're going to circulate. And if they don't have answers to that, then I think it's really hard for us to evaluate how this building would fit in it. So yeah, I think that's an important part.
Hey, Amy, I just to give you a quick answer on some of this. It would be a lot simpler for us if we just owned a 2-acre piece like 702 or the 6th in Maine, where we're just coming in for that. Abir and I spent a lot of time with the Oz group in trying to figure out long-term how we're going to activate this block. And again, to try to activate 4 sides of 3 buildings is a lot of retail, and how to bring that into that park and so for us, this is we're not going to be constrained by UDOT constraints on the other corners, number one. And number two, to get 350 or so residents here, 600 plus people is a really good way to kick off that retail on a nighttime perspective. And then obviously the hotel option or the office option is great synergy for the daytime uses. And so we have a big vision for the block. I wish I could speak more concretely on those other uses, but just know that we aren't constrained by UDOT on those corners.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't done much with you, Ryan, but I've worked on many community projects with the beer. So I feel good that, it's in the right hands to look at that future. And the question for Nan and staff, like, should you be looking at what those development potential for those other areas are, doesn't mean uses to me. To me, it means how this block will look configured and how it will function in those mid-block breakups and whatnot. And you successfully presented that. So for staff, I think that is super important for us, or for me. I'll just speak for me. It's super important for me to get a better idea of how this project that's before us right now will fit, because I'm going to look in the future too of like, how would we break this up? So you did a great job for Nan. I think this is the type of thing when we're looking at this size of developments that I need to better understand the bigger picture and the long term of how potential redevelopments will affect each other. But I have faith that Abir and his haberdashery will do well here.
I would like to come back to the issue of the length of the building, and I'm fairly convinced on the State Street side, but I am pretty concerned about the one of the things that Sarah was talking about, which is the importance of delineating the entrance to the residential building. And certainly on the park side, on the west facade, which we really haven't talked about, you still have that same length there, but with far less potential there to have the haberdashery breaking up the facade and adding interest. So I'm looking now at page 48 of our staff report, which is the rear facade. I would not call it the rear. It's actually the entrance facade for the project. And I think I don't know whether it's just the rendering that's underdeveloped, but it doesn't seem to me to be as interesting or clever, and I think it needs to be interesting and have some indication of that, better indication of that lobby, that it's not just another retail area, that it's something different. Because over here you have the lobby, right behind that red car, I think is where it is, and it just looks like more retail. And I think that's something that needs to be. Sorry?
Isn't that the only entry on that entire length? When you go further down, it's like mechanical stuff and whatnot.
Yeah, when you go down farther, it's mechanical stuff, which doesn't bother me. You have to have that somewhere, and they've got it sort of sliced in there, in what is not on the park and not real and really on a side street. But I do think that there's. It just seems like this is a really underdeveloped side compared, especially to the kind of thoughtfulness you've done on the State Street side. So I'm just asking that we consider that point that Sarah was making about the residential entrance and how that really, especially how it plays in response to the park and everything else over in this area. I mean, this is, in this particular instance, for example, you have that large screen, that black screen for the parking garage going across the whole thing, right up to the edge of the circulation tower, that makes it seem like it's all one thing, even though it's not all one thing at all. I mean, there's retail, there's a lobby, there's an entrance to the parking garage. So, and that entrance to the parking garage is the one that retail users will use. So if you're going to park to go to the haberdashery, you'll go in there. So it seems to me like that articulation needs to be a lot different and more and more conditioned on what's actually going on there.
So Brenda, I actually have a question following up on that. I had that same issue with that third floor screen on the other side as well. I mean, it feels like it goes along that whole way. I was wondering if the fact that it's up on the third floor, will that matter as I'm thinking of a pedestrian walking by and, my interactions with buildings. I don't know that I ever know what's on the third floor. From a distance and from the park, it matters. But I'm wondering, because that bothered me on the other side too. So I don't know the solution, but I'd love the perspective, your perspective, and then of course the developers.
Well, I think it's sort of the distance you get away from it, actually. And in this case, you'll be able to see it from across the park. And the other case across State Street. So yeah, you'll see it. The question is, does it bother you that much? I think it's on the other side. It's actually broken up more with some other screening elements on top of it. This one has an inconsistency between what I'm seeing in this particular drawing and the one I'm seeing in our staff report. Even though they both have the red car. So, again, we need with this, I'm not, right now, I don't want to go into a petite critique of this. I just want to say, let's figure this out a little bit more consistently with the kind of care that you've shown on the other side.
Yeah, that's a really good. I'm glad you brought that up, Brenda. I think when we have more time, we need to spend more time walking you all through this. The renderings don't convey what's happening here, and ironically, I think when we were working with Nan and staff, we actually spent a lot of time focusing on the interior street and not as much time focusing on state. And we did the reverse for this presentation. And I think we need to circle back and show you all a little bit more detail about what's happening here. But just to give you an idea, Matt, if you could just go to the floor plan real quick. On the north side of the service alley that's facing the park, what you see there is actually for new residents, prospective residents, when they walk in, this will be kind of the lobby where they'll meet with leasing staff, but it's actually going to open up into the retail space. We want there to be kind of a blurring of the lines between what happens in that lobby and the activity that's happening in that retail space. We're anticipating that be some sort of food service retailer or restaurant that's kind of open there. And so that's all going to have outdoor dining that faces to the west, that faces that park. So it's going to be very active right there. And then to the south of the service drive, we've got the residential lobby. And this is what Ryan was alluding to. This is the primary lobby for residents who live at the building. This is where they're gonna walk in and out of. And there's a lot of elements there. And then unfortunately, we think that this is part of the CBD of Salt Lake City, but Rocky Mountain Power does not. And as a result, they're making us put transformers on the building facade. It took a lot of back and forth, and I don't want to bore everyone with the details, but originally this was on State Street per Rocky Mountain Power. We worked with them to move it off of State Street. So we do have a large transformer space there, but I think we'll do something cool with some art element to bring in some public art onto that street facade. And then the other thing that should be noted is above the office, the leasing office in the lobby, there'll be a mezzanine. And I'm so glad, Brenda, that you acknowledged the 2-story volume. That was really important to us. We really wanted to activate this space and make it seem grand because it is grand. And so we're going to have 2-story space on this side of the building as well. And that's going to be co-working space. So there'll be people officing up there and working out there, and that'll activate the second floor above our lobby. But when we come next time in front of you, we'll do a better job of showing you images of exactly what that's going to look like.
Yeah, the only thing I'd like to add is, architecture is a little bit about wayfinding, and I think what Brenda's alluding to is just maybe making some sort of an anchor point, because just if you think of it like you've seen the building a lot and you're really used to seeing it from every angle, but try to think from a fresh set of eyes, how am I going to find the leasing office and what's going to draw me into that space? And I think if you think about it that way, creating an iconic entry there that really says, hey, come over here and this is where you need to go, I think that'll help you guys. So.
That's great. Yeah, that's a good perspective for us to keep in mind, because you're right. We have looked at this quite a bit, but I think having that fresh perspective is really important to us, and it'll help us design a better building. So thank you.
Okay. I have one quick question. Since the park is going to be private, are you deed restricting it to prohibit development? How are you going to maintain it ensure that it remains open space?
Ryan, I don't know if you want to tackle this question or.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it has all of our underground infrastructure in it, and we do plan on, or at least wanting to entertain, maybe doing some single-story structures on it for like coffee shops. So we want to bring in food trucks and engage it. And so, but as far as future development goes, I mean, honestly, it's an amenity to all 3 of our corners. The office bleeds onto it as well. And so we haven't really thought of the need to deed restrict. If you feel there's that need, I'm open to consider it, but it's the green space was entirely just for our own amenity's sake and not necessarily meant to be restricted.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, the green space in the middle, our park, this is the heart of our block. And like, yeah, we want to make sure that we maintain an active edge for sure. But for us, the central amenity for this entire block is bringing in green space into the inside of the block. This is where there'll be a hub of activity. This is where we anticipate people dining and walking their dogs and throwing a Frisbee, and the whole name of the block.
I'm not discounting its importance to your project. It's clearly very important to your project, but if for whatever reason, 10 years down the line, somebody has a different vision for that space, then it's a very different type of project. That's my only question. And
I think that that's very valid, and you bring up a good point. I mean, Ryan and I, we're not merchant builders. This is a legacy development for us, and so we had honestly, until you just brought it up, we have no intentions of selling it. We're holding this long term indefinitely, and so for us, it was just this obvious, like, oh yeah, this is going to be a park, and there'll be nothing else. But you're right. I think that we should look at, if something unforeseen happens and we don't own the property indefinitely for whatever reason, we think that that's a critical element for the success of this block. So yeah.
Well, and first, there's no room for foundations. I mean, the storm tech and just how the discharge point is into this stormwater system is so low that we only have a few feet of coverage between the top of those tanks and the sod or whatever hardscape's there. And so it really is.
That may be sufficient. There was just a question, from my mind, ensuring that this remained open space if that's part of the plan and it's not being dedicated.
Yeah, no problem.
That's
I'm
valid.
going through it myself, just trying to figure out why the answer to that. But that's our biggest concern, is just how we even can build anything on it, due to the lack of depth of the tanks.
All right. Commissioners, any other comments? I should be cognizant of our time here. We do have another agenda item.
Well, I would just like to add, because you guys brought it up, but the lack of depth there also means that you won't be able to have significant vegetation like trees. Is it not?
Well,
or water features, or right now it's a bit just green. What I used to call with my students green slime. We don't know what it is. So I mean, I was looking at it thinking, oh, it's going to be like, Rittenhouse Square someday, which is in Philadelphia, and it's beautiful, and it's not too different in size from this. So, but if it doesn't have the possibility of having vegetation, because it's basically just, an underground water system with a green roof on it, that makes it different than a park.
Yeah, so Brenda, the nice part about, storm tech is one of the many systems we can use, but there are a series of tanks that connect, and you can modify that configuration. So we haven't gotten into that level of detail yet. We have sized it. Surprisingly, it takes up about the entire park, but we plan on having about 50% of the park be hardscaped and 50% be landscaped, so that it's very usable. I think that between raised planters and how we can space the tanks to get the root systems to work for where we want the trees, we'll have that ability to make it beautiful. It's not meant to just be a tank with some slime on top. I think that it's an important feature to Javier and I, and it's meant to look like it and feel like a park, with a lot of places to sit and enjoy it where it's not necessarily grass.
And if it would be helpful for the next time we're in front of you, we can show you some of our the designs that we're thinking of for this central park.
Anything that will get us to the point where we can really see this happening. It also, I think, helps with public perceptions of this project as well. If people see that whatever we do in the planning commission, approvals of any kind of like this, one of the things that we're getting out of this is an amenity that the public can also use, which is really good.
All right. Any last comments? Otherwise, I'm going to ask Nan. Nan, did we sufficiently address your questions?
Yes, you did. Thank you.
Okay. Great. I'm going to thank you all for coming back and for the presentation. That was really helpful. And we look forward to your return.
Great. Thank you all so much for your time. We appreciate it.
Hey, can I just ask what the next step is?
You come back. I'm assuming.
Ryan, I'll be in contact with you after this. We'll talk about the next steps.
Thanks, Nan. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Ryan.
Okay, moving on now to item number 2, deleting special exceptions from the zoning ordinance and associated ordinance changes. Case number PLN PCM 2020-6060. And Nick is presenting.
All right, we will go through this relatively quick. So this is a text amendment that we're proposing primarily due to changes in workloads and demand and our ability as a city to respond to development needs and growth needs that we're experiencing. And you guys are well aware of all those, so I'm not going to get into that too much. This project is still in the early engagement phase until October 11th. So this was, we moved this up. It was initially on the 14th agenda, but we decided we'd move this up since it's a work session and to free up some time and to give you guys an introduction to this project. It's fairly technical in nature and involves a lot of section of code. So we'll just dive into that real well, if I can get my, there we go. So you guys know what special exceptions are. They're basically small little changes to an incidental use or a dimensional requirement. We average about 150 applications per year. They're approved either by the staff level, most of them, the Planning Commission, or the Historic Landmarks Commission. They're not distributed very equally across the city. 85% of them are east of I-15. You can see District 1 and District 7 are the districts that have the smallest number. But one of the things that's important about this is that it gives you an idea of where in the city these things are being applied for. More than the majority of them are in Districts 3 and District 5. Part of that is because of the unique nature of development patterns in those neighborhoods and being the oldest, some of the oldest neighborhoods around. We spend about 20 hours per application. You can see the equivalency in number of FTEs that this is on. Right now, our application fees generate about $41,000 in revenue, but that only covers about 40% of the cost to process these. And so the city, we're subsidizing through the general fund the process of applications where people are simply looking to increase their development rights. So why change it? I talked a little bit about this already, but our staff resources can be redirected to address growth-related needs. There's the geography. It also helps simplify the code. A lot of times when people call us, we have to give them 4 or 5 different scenarios and answers of what they can and can't do. And so as we move forward with changing our approach to zoning citywide, the special exceptions make that really difficult. One of the things that we hear a lot about is we're pitting neighbor against neighbor because special exceptions create a development potential that is unexpected and not within the general scope of what the zoning says. We'll get into some of those a little bit. It also helps align with how property is currently used, and the neighbors know what to expect. So there's over 40 different special exceptions. We're not going to go over all of those in this presentation, although in the Dropbox you have a document that the public has seen that goes over these, but we're going to go over some of the key things and the ones that we see a lot of. And so these are kind of the 10 most popular things. Within historic districts, through the special exception process, you can change any kind of bulk modification. The Landmarks Commission can change any bulk modification. Right now, it requires multiple applications to be able to do that. And so this change would maintain that authority, but have it be done through the existing processes in the historic district overlay. Grade changes and retaining walls. Basically, right now, you can get a special exception to build any height retaining wall. There's no limits. There's no design standards. We've had some as tall as 20 to 30 feet. For those of you who've been on the commission for a while, you may recall one up in the Upper Federal Heights neighborhood that was pretty sizable. This proposal would require a stepping within those retaining walls, like what's shown in the picture. Building height is another one of our most frequently requested proposals. It would go away, and instead we would rely on the development pattern of the block face. So if you have buildings that are taller than the maximum that's allowed in the underlying zoning district, you could get the average of those taller structures instead of having to go through a special exception. And obviously the Landmarks Commission will retain their authority to increase when it's compatible with the historic districts. Accessory structure height, we're not changing anything by right. However, we are proposing a change to the code that would allow an accessory structure to go up to 75% of the height of a principal building, provided the setbacks increase. So right now, any accessory building in a residential district can go up to 17 feet in height. The SR1A and the avenues, primarily in Capitol Hill, has different standards, and those wouldn't change. But this would allow those properties that do have taller structures to to increase their height as well. How the accessory buildings are used right now, if you want to locate an office or a hobby shop or a fitness room or even a changing room for an outdoor pool or whatever, technically you're supposed to get a special exception for those things. That's not really reflective of how particularly rear yards are being used now and accessory buildings are being used. And so these would just become by right. You can do these things. It doesn't make any sense in our mind that you could do these outdoors without any kind of special approval or under a covered patio or in a do an addition onto the home that essentially is a shed and do it by right. And so that would be a change. Inline additions, this is probably one of the more significant changes that we're proposing. And we're proposing to eliminate those in side yards. And you can see in the picture that's on the right hand of the screen, an inline addition that was approved several years, probably 10 plus years ago now, didn't meet setbacks, but the code at the time allowed you to go up at your existing setback line. It creates new impacts to neighbors that they weren't anticipating or expecting. This proposal would eliminate it in the side yard, but allow it in the rear yard and the front yard, primarily because those set yards are generally larger and there's more space. And so the diagram on the left is a building footprint from up on the east bench where you can see that setback requirement, rear yard setback requirement is 35 feet. At the closest, it's 20 feet. And so it would allow that cutout area to be filled in, but not extend it further than the furthest point of the building. Non-complying buildings, these really aren't, a lot of things are listed as special exceptions, but these are really property right issues. And we want to use the non-conforming chapter to address these. These include replacement of segments of buildings or accessory structures, eliminating the conditional use, which you guys have seen some of these things where somebody in a zone wants to rebuild or expand a single family home that is in a zone that doesn't allow single family homes. And then also moving the unit legalization process into this section from the special exception. The purpose of the unit legalization is to create a method for long-standing basement apartments that were done without permits but have been in existence for decades to be formally recognized. And so that, to us, that's a non-conforming use issue that is better addressed through this process than another process. Front yard parking is one of those that we are, frankly, within the planning division even mixed on. This is a special exception that when your backyard isn't accessible or you don't have the side yard to provide a parking spot, that allows one parking stall, like in this picture, to be put in your front yard. Our proposal right now is to eliminate this. This is one that we definitely want some feedback from the Planning Commission on as to whether or not it's significant enough or minimal enough that we should allow it to continue or not allow it. Ground mounted utility boxes, this is another significant proposal that we're considering, is that when these are necessary for, or when these are proposed for private developments, that they're not be allowed in the right of way. These should be accommodated as part of the development on their private property and not be utilized in the right of way. They prevent us from making changes to our rights of way over time. For example, you can see these large utility boxes that were necessary for undergrounding power, but also for transformers for the development that's we will never be able to alter this portion of the right of way for any reason because we have some private infrastructure in there. And so we want to make sure that those things are accommodated on private property. There are potential issues with, for example, if somebody wants to change the use of an existing building, say it's a historic building and they want to convert it to some other use that requires a higher energy load and they need to add transformers. So we're trying to figure out the best way to accommodate that type of use where it's not possible to put it on the building. And we're also working with Rocky Mountain Power on how these utility boxes relate to when we underground power, which is something that the city has several goals upon doing. But if we're going to do that, it means we're going to have some boxes somewhere. So we got to figure that part out too. Just to give you an update on the community input, info has been sent to every single community council and recognized organization. We sent a request to AIA Utah for to spread the word amongst the architecture community. Architects are one of the more frequent applicants for special exceptions representing property owners. One thing that I don't know that the Planning Commission, maybe you guys are aware of this, but since COVID in March, we've shifted all of our open houses online. So we don't do in-person open houses anymore. And we're starting to get some data on what that means as far as how many people are engaged. Normally for an open house, we'd get less than 5 people to show up for an item like this. And the great thing about website analytics is we can see how many people have accessed it and downloaded the information. And you can see that for something as exciting as special exception changes, we've had 135 people access the online open house page or download it. Sorry, that's a little word, and 179 who have viewed the page. So just a couple of questions. I don't know that we expect answers here, but if there are some follow-up questions from the from the commission, we went over these through the presentation that was super short, and I probably talked too fast. But if anybody has any questions on these or wants to add any input, we're all ears.
So in my neighborhood, Nick, fence height is one of the things which has people all riled up. So what is the idea there with fence height?
So the city council separately asked us to look at fence height. So we are making changes to that. That's, even though it is a special exception, it's a separate thing because of how it was started. And so that will be coming to you guys, but we are proposing to eliminate the ability to seek additional fence height, particularly in front yards, where those are the most frequently denied special exceptions. I think they make up close to 90% of all the denied special exceptions. And then establishing a cap of what it can be in a side and a rear yard. That number, I think, is right now sitting at 6 feet in height, with the ability to add like some sort of lattice or something else above that. I don't know that we are fully married to 6 feet in height, or that if it could go taller when it's in a rear yard. And then the Planning Commission would retain the authority to increase fence height for buffering purposes when you're reviewing an application.
Nick, could you expound a little bit more on front yard parking? Like, when is it considered front yard parking and versus maybe a driveway that doesn't extend all the way through? Like, what's the parameters of this?
Yeah, so a driveway connects to a legally located off-street parking spot by definition. So that's a garage, it's a space on the side of the house or something in the rear yard, a parking pad, a detached garage that's accessed from an alley or a driveway. This is, the difference is this would simply be a concrete pad that sits in between the sidewalk and the front of the house, because there's no way to get to the rear yard, or there's no way to add a parking stall on the side of the house. Does that make sense?
So it's just in front of the house, because the picture you showed looked like it was off to the side, but I can't remember now.
I can go back. Yeah, right there. It actually is. So in this picture, this is one that went through the process. I think there's only 3 feet on their property between the property line and the house, and there's only 6 feet between those two homes. And so there's not enough space to fit a car. And so this is an example of what would be front yard parking.
If that particular house had enough space for a side, for like a driveway, but they choose not to have a full driveway and they just want a parking pad right there, you would not consider that front yard parking. Because it's off to the side of the house, but they don't want to make it a through driveway. That's okay. Okay. That's helpful. Yeah. Whenever I think of front yard parking, I think of people parking on their lawns, and I always say, there's a few things I don't allow in my neighborhood. You don't park on your lawns, you don't abandon shopping carts, and you don't put your couches out on the parking strip for free.
Right. And one of the flip sides of this is that even if a driveway extends into the side yard or the rear yard, there's nothing that prevents somebody from parking in that portion of the driveway that's in their front yard. And I mean, you go everywhere and you see that. And we don't want to get down to the point where we have to enforce on something like that. And so that's where this doesn't make much difference whether it goes down to the side or not, if people are going to be parking in that same general location. That's just one of the things that we've debated about in our office.
So wait, now I'm confused. So what are we eliminating? The ability to do this or the ability to require a special exception to do this?
So right now, the only way to get a parking stall like what is in the picture would be to get a special exception approval for that. With this special exception going away, it means that we would not be allowing someone to put a parking pad in their front yard.
So this is if you have a house in the avenues and you're on a lot you're right up next to your neighbors and you don't have access via an alley to the rear, but you want an off-street parking space like this, you would no longer have an opportunity to do that.
Under this, how the proposal is written right now, that's correct.
Okay.
I kind of have a problem with that. I'm not worried about the avenues too much, but I am worried about the west side where there are some houses that are fairly close together where where this might be a real big issue for a lot of people who live on streets that are, especially parts of the west side, where that are very busy and they don't want to park their car in the street. So, I'm a little concerned that this is directed at, pretty expensive neighborhoods, whereas neighborhoods that are more modest really may need this kind of accommodation.
Nick, do you have any idea of the numbers of special exceptions that are requesting this? Because I feel like this is something people might just do and not even know that they're supposed to file for it because they're like, it's my yard, I'm just going to do this. Does it have to be adjacent to a curb cut, to like this driveway entrance where there's not a driveway? I mean, do you have any numbers to give us an idea of where these things are happening? Because I can only think of them happening in the avenues, but that doesn't mean it doesn't happen elsewhere.
We have the numbers of every type of special exception that's been applied for the last, I think, 4 years. We didn't break that down by, we might have broken it down by council district. I'd have to look at that table. But yeah, we know that this one isn't, that sometimes does get denied.
I would just ask if there's a way to do it where they have to meet certain standards, where you can't park like in front of your door or something specific. There's some certain setbacks from certain areas, and then it's allowed.
Or minimum lot width, so that
Right.
you're not just like parking your car right in front of your house, literally.
Yeah.
Or that you have to have a cutout like this one does. I'm guessing at some point there was a driveway and then they extended this house. Where, so they're not like driving up over the curb to get to it. Maybe there's ways to allow it, but have certain provisions that you have to meet these standards.
So yeah, I would guess one of the situations where this happens a lot is when we've had former alleys which in the avenues, we've had all kinds of private alleyways and public alleyways and weird streets that go through the blocks that are vacated or closed to those property owners, and they never established a right. And so it may very well be that this house did at one point have access from the rear, but for whatever reason, at no fault of that property owner, more than likely it went away. And then they're stuck with kind of their existing condition of how to park at their property. All right, well, we can certainly look into some potential standards and have those ready for when this comes back to the commission.
Well, one of the things I might suggest is that, this doesn't seem such a big deal if there's a series of driveways on the street that are like this. In other words, if the next door neighbor has a driveway and the next door neighbor has a driveway and the guy across the street has a driveway that go to their backyard, then having a driveway like this is sort of a normal pattern of the neighborhood.
Blocks where nobody has the driveway.
Yeah, would be different. Or that where this is not following a pattern for whatever reason.
Right.
I don't know the conditions, and maybe that would help if we knew some of the conditions.
Yeah. Okay, we can certainly look into that.
And if there's a way to require that they don't park on the part of the driveway in between the sidewalk and the street.
There's actually already an ordinance that prohibits that. It's not a zoning issue. It's in the streets section of our code.
All right. Well, just thought I'd throw it out there. Okay. What were your other questions?
So one of the things that we've run into, which you've seen in the last few or a couple of recent applications, is one of the special exceptions is the extra height in commercial districts on sloping lots. And frankly, we've only had one project in the previous 4 years until recently that even worried about this and was kind of put in this situation where they had to deal with it. It does tend to happen more in our commercial districts that have very low maximum building heights, the CN and CB zones particularly, because there's just not a lot of flexibility. And so this is something that has really come on our radar after the last two planning commission meetings as to, is there a way that we can accommodate that height on sloping lots when they're, when that height increase is only a couple of feet and it's necessary based on the slope of the property, particularly at the street level.
Anyone have thoughts or concerns? I think it seems reasonable.
Yeah. So what is it similar to what you would do with a single family house in terms of extra height? I mean, is it a problem of how we measure height? Is it average height versus height from at any given point along the street, or what? I mean, I know that how we measure height is part of the equation here.
It is a component of how we measure height, and basically in residential districts, height follows the contours of the land, and so right. you just have to fit into that. It's a little bit different with commercial districts because we measure the average of each face. But when you have a sloping lot and one face is fine, it impacts the other faces of the building too. And they don't have the same slope necessarily. So it creates this, right. It's not a rectangular box that they can fit in. It becomes a more obtuse type of box. And so there's part of that. And we can, I think my preference is to try to figure out a way to make it easier to deal with that, so that it's not creating an increase in like habitable space, which I think is the intent of limiting height, but it allows for sloping properties. And I think people think Salt Lake is generally flat once you get off the benches, but it's really not. We have all kinds of, sometimes you can have a slope differential of 6 or 7 feet across 100 feet on something that you don't perceive that visually when you're walking down the street.
Nick?
Nick,
Oh, just sorry, Brenda. I'm just letting Nick know. Crystal can't unmute, and she wants to contribute. And so,
yeah, that's what I was going to say too.
oh, okay.
I probably need to stop sharing my screen to do this, but I didn't know that she had joined us, but let me figure this out here.
Let's just do unlimited height on sloping lots. That might.
That's the architect's answer.
All right.
Unlimited height on all lots. So that's great.
That's right. Whatever I want to do, that's the answer.
All right. Crystal, you're a panelist now, so you should be able, I think. Yes, you should be able to speak freely.
Thank you. I don't have anything like vitally important to say, but I don't have any problems with height allowances pretty much in most places, but certainly on a sloping lot.
It depends on the length of the lot. I mean, in my opinion, the one I'm thinking about mainly is the sloping changes that we kind of permitted that are on, what can I think of that street, Wilmington in Sugar House. I mean, because that one, they use that height, sloping height, to way to their advantage. I mean, to build a structure that was great advantage. It's one thing if you've got a lot that's 60 or 100 feet wide. It's different than when you've got a 372-foot building that they're putting up and calling it all one building. To say they can't step that in some way is not, there's got to be some length as well. I mean, if you're going to just allow things more by right.
Okay.
Okay. If there's nothing else on height, the next thing, and this one's really more technical, but the utility boxes in the right of way. Were there any concerns about us prohibiting that?
No.
Okay. And we will be meeting with Rocky Mountain Power, like I said, to make sure that we're not negatively impacting them. They actually are on board with this, by the way. We've already started talking to them, and they generally are supportive of that concept. And then accessory structure building height changes with the ability to go up to 75% of the principal structure. Any concerns?
That's some kind of shed.
Yeah, why?
If you're talking about a little garden shed, yeah, I was just getting ready to rebuild my tea house after the wind blew it down. But now that I'm going to 75%, I may need to make it, like 15 feet tall. That'd be cool.
Well, your setbacks would increase. So.
Oh, from the property line. I see.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. How does that work? The setbacks versus the height?
So basically, if anything, right now, the minimum setback for like an accessory building is just 1 foot from side or rear property line. And so anything above that 17-foot permitted height, so say you had say 75% was 22 feet, you'd have to increase that setback 5 additional feet from that. So it wouldn't be, the idea is to help reduce primarily the shadowing and shading into other people's yards and some fire separation. The likelihood of a taller shed having uses other than just storage go up considerably. And so that's kind of why we would want to have some additional setback.
So can you remind me what the current percentage allowance is?
For height, it's not a percentage. It's in most zoning residential districts, it's capped at 17 feet for a pitched roof and 13 feet for a flat roof structure.
So if you have a 3-story house, then you could build a 2-story, 2.5-story shed? Is that what you're saying?
That's right.
Well, that gets back to that picture I showed, which had some sort of habitable space in the second level above that shed. But if you went to that, your setback would have to be significant, and you'd have to have a sizable enough property to be able to accommodate that.
So like, how are people asking for this? Like, is this what people want to build now? I'm just curious, like, what is the genesis of this?
So we do see a lot of requests for particularly detached garages to be taller than 17 feet. Most people want it for storage purposes, but they want to be able to walk around up there. But there have been some for things like hobby shops. The ADU ordinance already allows an increase in height if it is an ADU above a garage. And so this kind of mirrors that a little bit.
It seems to me you would still want some maximum, like no matter what the percentage is, you can't exceed X. You can go up to, but not exceed. But
I agree with that.
Okay.
And I just wonder the preference between like a pitched roof or a flat roof. Is it a percentage of the roof that we're looking at for height, or are we looking at max height? Do they do like an A-frame that goes super high, or, you know, like what are we looking at?
Yeah, so the way a pitched roof structure is measured in the residential districts is to the peak. So if that height is 17 feet, that's to the peak. And so depending on, and there's a definition of what a sloped roof is, it has to be over a certain slope, or have 2 sloping planes over a certain slope or something like that, and or 1 plane, I think. And so those are in the code already. Any other comments on the accessory structure? All right, and then the final one that we are a little that we have some concerns about is eliminating the inline additions in side yards. So if I can add a little bit more definition of what that means is right now, so side yard setbacks in Salt Lake up until about 2005 were measured as a percentage of the building height. So depending on how tall the building is, that is how big of a side yard setback you had to have. That changed and went to a fixed number, and it varies a little bit by residential districts, but it's essentially 4 feet on one side and 10 feet on the other. But because of how we used to measure it, we have some very small side yard setbacks in a lot of our older parts of the city. And so this special exception would allow you to extend, like do an addition on your home along a side yard that didn't meet the current setbacks. So for example, you may have a setback of 3 feet. If you got special exception approval, you could extend that setback up to your rear yard requirement along. So if it was an additional 25 or 30 feet of length, you could be at 3 feet. Under this proposal, that addition would have to meet the current setback. So it'd have to be stepped in a little bit, depending on what zone you're in.
My question would be, could we do it where you allow it as long as it's the same height as the existing house, and if it goes taller, then it increases the setback?
are you thinking that if you have a 2-story house with a 5-foot setback, and if they did a 1-story addition, they could still request to maintain that 5-foot setback for the 1-story addition, but if they wanted to go to a 2-story addition, they would have to meet the current setback requirements. Is that what you're saying, John?
I'm thinking more of as long as they match the kind of design intent of their existing structure and don't go taller, like if they have a 1-story house and they want 2 stories at that setback, that starts to be proportionally off. And so my question would be, if they're going to do a 2-story addition off the back of a single-story house, then you increase the setback so that you're not creating a scale issue, if that makes sense. I guess the only thing I would add is I guess you could build a 3-story addition in your backyard that would hover over top of a 1-story addition in the front yard, and it would have the same setback, and that's kind of what I would be trying to avoid. That makes sense.
But they could just do that with their shed.
Exactly.
Okay.
All right. Any other comments? All right. If we get once the early engagement period ends, we'll have a better idea of what, if any, community input we've had on this. We've had very little so far, but we'll see where that lands, and if there's any other issues, we'll have those prepared for whenever we go back to the Planning Commission. We are hoping to get this transmitted to the City Council by the end of this calendar year. So we're looking at coming back probably the November meeting.
So Nick, I do have one follow-up. So if somebody wanted to do one of these things you want to just eliminate, would they then have the option to apply for special consideration with the Planning Commission, or would it just be like, nope, this is not allowed?
It would be a no, it's not allowed. So basically, what we're doing with each special exception is going to fall into one of 3 categories. It's either going to be just allowed by right, with some sort of additional standard that they'd have to comply with, like what we've talked about with like front yard parking and things like that, or it'll be prohibited. And so, for example, one of the special exceptions that we didn't talk about here is if somebody wanted to locate their mechanical equipment within a required yard. That's something that, due to a number of noise complaints and things like that we've gotten over the years, we're just not going to allow that to encroach further than the setbacks in ordinance already. So that would be a special exception that would just go away. There's a bunch of special exceptions, probably a dozen or so, that we can't find anyone who's ever applied for them. And so there's no point in keeping those kinds of exceptions. Those would also just go away. But there's others, like what we've talked about here, that make a lot of sense, that people are doing regardless of seeking permits. And I think part of that is a reflection of over regulation of certain things that aren't actually necessary to achieve the purpose of the zoning district. And when people see that it's a burden to go through something, they're just going to do it anyway. And if those things are happening and they're not necessarily impacting people and we're not getting complaints about it, then the question really is, why are we restricting it to begin with?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm all for like not allow, if we're going to get rid of them, that they don't have an avenue then to keep trying for it further. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else, Nick?
That's all I have, if there's no more comments from the commission.
Any other comments for Nick? No? Can't find my mouse. There it goes. Okay. With that, we will adjourn. Thank you all for your time this afternoon. Appreciate it.
Thank you.